This is In Studio. I'm your host, Jay Daniels. Our guest today is Jennifer Gammill. She is not only one of the talented female composers of our time, but she's also a gifted vocalist, pianist, and flutist. Primarily, she is a jazz performer, but like many musicians, she's also well-versed in classical, sacred, and Celtic music. In the time that we have, we're going to try and talk about each of those things today. Jennifer, welcome to In Studio. We're glad to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Before our interview, I was listening to some of your recordings, both recent and some from the not-so-distant past. But you just recently released the album Heart, Soul, and Fire. And it's an album featuring all original works like Across the Cafe, Ran in the Rain, and Endless Blue. Now, this is your fourth release. Your first was an album called Faith back in 2008. When did you transition from being solely a performer to being a songwriter?
So I would say actually I've been a songwriter for most of my life. Like I remember my dad asking me to, he had written some words and asking me to put music to it. And, at that time I was very beginner in piano, didn't know anything about theory. So I would, try to put something to it. In high school, my friends and I wrote songs. Like we thought we were going to be the next Point of Grace. And then I wrote in college, and I won't say that stuff was very good, but it takes a long time to get really good at something. And my second album is also singer-songwriter, also original. And it's funny because recently I went through like a book about being an artist, and I kind of was able to take more of a bird's eye view and look at because it might look like, oh, I've meandered through all these different styles. But in a bird's eye view, I'm like, but in every style, I've been writing songs. I've written worship music, I've written pop music, so it was kind of really cool to see that. And now I'm kind of identifying more as I am a singer-songwriter, So yeah, I don't know if I would say it's a transition in my music, but in maybe how I'm identifying myself.
Do you have a process when you write songs that you go through?
Yeah, I usually write lyrics. Like I'll often just jot something down in my notes app in my phone, and sometimes those don't go anywhere. Sometimes that I keep developing them, keep adding stuff, and then usually there's kind of a rhythm to the words when I'm kind of conscious of that as I continue writing, and then I'll sit down and put some music to it. That's my usual process for that.
From where do you get a lot of your inspiration for writing music, writing lyrics?
From everyday life. Just stuff that happens to me. So it's very cathartic for me to like I said, even if it's not going to go anywhere, even just writing down, getting those thoughts out, it's very therapeutic.
I want to talk about the musical aspect of your songwriting. In this last album, Heart, Soul, and Fire, from a perspective of musicality, there are alternating rhythms, there are alternating time signatures in the music, and it's not just straight 4/4 swing the entire time, it's not straight blues the entire time. There is a great mixture. In fact, the music carries a bit of personality. Did you take any sort of training to really hone in on how to develop certain rhythms, certain musical patterns within your music?
So I would say when I started studying jazz, which was about maybe 7 years ago, I took a couple classes. One was vocal jazz. Another was, I took some theory and stuff like that. So in the vocal jazz class, they showed us how to put together a set list. And because I would say modern jazz for vocalists, you really draw from swing, you draw from the blues, you draw from Latin, you want to have a variety in your set list. And I guess I've kind of followed that with my album. So, that's why you hear kind of those different styles. And plus, I would get bored if I was listening to an album and the whole thing was the same. So, yeah. And you definitely hear some of that pop influence in there. I don't think I can ever, that's always going to be there.
Did you have, while you were coming up and you were listening to jazz music, did you have any artists that you would say were influences upon your love of the art form?
Oh, there's several. There's one girl, her name's Candace Springs, and she's more of like a singer-songwriter, jazz, a little bit more maybe R&B. But I
Yeah.
remember Jay Sennett showing her to me and, kind of like introducing me to her music. And I was like, oh, somebody else it started to give me like, I guess, a window into, oh, I could be kind of like that. And I mean, locally, definitely, Jay Sennett, like I said, he's been kind of my teacher and mentor for the past few years. And Justin Coughlin, who's on that Echoes album that you heard, he's a pianist from the local area, but it's like, worldwide now. And I remember going to listen to him play and just almost crying. Um, you had mentioned earlier about like how, you know, well, this is kind of going ahead probably, but how music can be
Sure.
ministry, even if it's not, you know, Christian per se or if in the church. And I remember going to listen to Justin, and it really touched my soul in a way that, like nothing in church had, I would say, for a long time.
And life itself for you has been an interesting journey to talk about. You grew up near Syracuse, New York, and then you came to Virginia to go to grad school down at Regent, and that's in the Virginia Beach region of the state. Would you say that life more or less took a different turn than you anticipated because you were going to school, studying theology to become a worship leader before you decided to do performance full time?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it was partly that I got a little burned out I did a 3-year undergrad and 2 years grad school. So in 5 years, I had gotten a master's degree. So I was a little burned out. But I was also burned out with ministry because I had been leading at a church plant the whole time I was in school. I was waiting tables. I was just kind of, I was exhausted. And then I actually got married at that point. But we both took some time off from ministry because, we grew up in the like, okay, you give a good chunk of your extra time to the church. And then we got married and we said, let's take some time off. And during that time off, I was working. I actually worked at Regent for a year. And a friend of mine said, hey, I heard about this singing group and I think you would really like it. So I go and audition as a soprano. It's like they sing in quartets. They do like the Dickens caroling at Christmas and
Sure.
all these different themed programs. But anyway, I got into that, and my first summer with them, we're singing at the ocean front on the street, like, and it's sometimes 95 degrees, and you're sweating and singing, but I would come home at midnight, and I would still be like singing in the car, just like thrilled that I just spent all this time performing. So that's when it started to click that like, oh my goodness, like this is what I want to do.
Now, along with your music and along with your marriage, you also have a family. You have 3 children that are in the mix of all of this. So is it difficult for you to do your performances? And sometimes you do have to travel out of town. How do you make that work with having 3 children in your life?
Right. It's a balancing act. I will
Kind of like a
say,
tightrope sometimes?
hopefully not that precarious.
Yeah,
Uh, um, the hardest, excuse me, the hardest times were the baby years because, and especially as an artistic person, you crave that time to do your craft, you have some alone time, that type of thing. So I would say those years were the most difficult for me in being an artist, but I was still out performing as much as I could. And thanks to my husband at the time, he was very supportive, as long as it wasn't every night of the week type of thing.
sure.
Um, but at the same time, they give me balance, personally, because, I think about what I do in the context of them in my life, if that makes sense.
Do they have any musical inclination?
They do, yes. They all do. I have 3, and I teach them all piano. And my oldest will sit down besides that, and she'll just pick out melodies and stuff like that. She'll make up some of her own stuff. But she's actually a visual artist, incredibly gifted visual artist. and then my youngest is going to be the performer, I think. So
So needless to say, music does run in the family. And was music something that you also grew up with? You mentioned your dad would have lyrics and that you would sometimes help him getting music with those. Was music also something important for you as a child?
it was. What's kind of funny is that my dad is tone deaf.
So he's not going to be singing any duets with you on the
You
next
don't
album.
want him to be singing any duet.
Please don't tell him. Please don't tell him we talked about him like this.
Oh no, he would totally agree with me. But my mom was always a singer. She is a singer.
Yeah.
So I was, always grew up hearing her in church, like, or we watched The Sound of Music a bazillion times, and she was singing along with it. So, and I think she was one of those that she could have had a music career, but it wasn't in the pages for her. So, yeah, so I definitely was around a lot of music.
Now, was jazz a part of that? You grew up, obviously, your family was quite involved in the church. Was jazz a part of that, or was that music that mostly was off limits during those years?
It wasn't necessarily off limits. I had zero exposure to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and I remember kind of, especially as I, came to be a teenager in college years and stuff, I was intensely curious about it because I would hear, sometimes, actually in college, we would go hear like some jazz trios because I went to school near Rochester. And it just tickled my ears, like, oh, what is that? What are they doing? And, but I would say the biggest thing that influenced me, liking jazz is Disney music.
Oh.
Yes, because, I grew up on The Lion King and Little Mermaid and all those, classic Disney movies. But the writer, like the songwriting in those is, in many ways, it's similar to jazz because it's got more harmonic complexity than, your pop music. And it's, all the old standards came from musicals.
Yeah.
So it really, and I remember when I first started studying jazz and I started realizing that, I was like, oh, it all makes sense. This is why, like, my ears gravitate toward harmony, toward some complexity there. So that's kind of where I see that coming from.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Our guest in studio is the talented pianist, vocalist, and composer, Jennifer Gammill. I want to talk more about some of your upbringing. Your earlier recordings were inspired by your own Christian faith. Thinking of the album Echoes, for instance, where there are a number of Christian, as they might be called, praise and worship tracks on there. And there was an earlier piano album that you did that they were the piano and flute arrangements of hymns. Thinking about your faith and your music, did one influence the other?
Oh gosh, I mean, to me, you almost can't separate them. So yes, and you know what? It's funny because we were just talking about harmonic complexity, and the hymns have them too. So, and when I was young, we were in a Baptist church, and then kind of transitioned more to the charismatic movement, and so yeah, all that. So it's interesting because I have both the hymn background and the praise and worship. The early '90s. There was a lot of stuff going on at that point, like Don Moen, Kent Henry, Ron Canoli. Like those were hugely influential for me as well.
Darlene Zschech was also one of those.
Oh yeah,
from the early '90s.
Oh yeah, I loved her.
Yeah.
So I guess. So how do I answer that question? So I mean, I guess, are you asking how I came to make those two albums? Like what was the thought process